Hey, how's it going? I think you can all hear me all right, right? Cool, okay, great. So I'm Bonnie. I go by Bo sometimes, and thank you for joining me for what is the last talk of the conference. Thank you so much to the organizers for having me here. It's been really amazing. I was here 6 years ago, and so I haven't been back for a little while, and it's really awesome to see how the conference has grown and changed. And all your games are really amazing, so thank you so much. So the talk that I'm going to be talking to you about is called Interrogating Empathy, Alternative Models of Queer Feeling in Video Games. So here's the plan. I'm going to tell you a little bit about me and my work. I'm going to tell you about empathy, because that's what we're talking about today, what makes it problematic, and what are some alternative ways we can think about feeling in video games, and specifically from this kind of queer perspective. And we'll talk more about what that means. And then we are going to do some game dev takeaways, because we need game dev takeaways, right? And I'm going to talk to you about why you should care about these things as students and game makers who can put these ideas into action in the work you make right away. And then we'll have a Q&A, which I have seeded with some predetermined Q&A questions, so you don't have to feel Q&A anxiety. Oh, I should also say that there are lots of cute animals in this talk, which I am not the world's most serious doctor. And also, it's the end of the conference, right? So you need cute animals, and cute animals make you feel feelings, and this is a talk about feelings, so cute animals. So me. I am an assistant professor of digital media and games at UC Irvine, which is in Southern California. I just wrapped up a postdoc at the University of Southern California in their interactive media and games program, which is a really amazing game-making program, with some great mentors like Richard Lamarchand, who was here last year. In terms of game making, I teach students to make games. So my primary thing is not that I make games myself, but I teach students to make games. And mostly I'm training them to use games as a medium for artistic and cultural expression. So I'm not the tech person, I'm the think social questions person. And then my own work, my own research focuses on game studies, which is this kind of academic area of research into making sense of games and their social meaning. And then within game studies, my specific focus is on gender and sexuality and queer studies. And back in the day, I think you may be too young to know this, but back in the day I used to be a games and tech journalist, also focusing on sex and gender in games. And I still kind of have one foot in the games industry. So what that means, all these things together, is that I am what we call interdisciplinary, which sounds nice and fancy in academic circles, but I think of it as meaning that I'm kind of sprawled out across all these different areas. So that's game making, games education, game studies, but also things like media studies, cultural studies, information studies, computer science. And so you always end up doing this funny little dance when you're interdisciplinary, where you're trying to perform your work differently in different settings. So the version that you're getting today, it might sound a little bit more theoretical than some of the other talks you've heard so far. And that's not just because I want to sound stuffy and academic. I promise I don't. But because I think it's really interesting to see this challenging theoretical work. I think you are super smart, super good critical thinkers, and so I want to kind of show you what this kind of research looks like, and invite you to kind of step inside it with me, help me think through these ideas, so that you can see that even when this stuff sounds kind of abstract, it has really important implications for game design and for games culture. This is my warning. I am a feminist, and I'm a queer person, and I believe in intersectionality, right? Intersectionality is this idea that different forms of oppression and privilege intersect. So we talk about race and feminism, socioeconomics and feminism. And I believe that video games are political, right? Even when they don't seem to be about politics, they have cultural meaning. This may sound like some really basic things to tell you about, but games culture is a turbulent and sometimes pretty violent place. And this stuff sometimes really pisses people off. Richard mentioned earlier today getting death threats. Death threats are kind of the name of the game when you're a feminist in games culture. I feel it is my honor to have gotten a whole array of handwritten death threats at some point. This is how you can tell that like the mediums of communication are changing, that when I started this work 12 years ago, people were handwriting me death threats. It's somehow a mark of honor. So this is your invitation. If you are the type of person who gets really angry when feminists stand up on stage and talk about video games and their social meaning, hey, how's it going, you people? You are totally welcome to stand up and head out or storm out. This is your moment, because that happens when I give talks, and that's cool. You all seem like really wonderful, woke people, so maybe that's not what you want to do, but here's your invitation. You're still seated, that's good. Okay, so I want to talk to you about queerness and games, but first let's start with some of these basic definitions. So you'll hear me say this word a lot, this word queer. What does that mean? So I won't ask you to answer this like with words, but maybe just a show of hands. When you hear this word queer, do you feel like you know what that means? Awesome. Okay, that's actually a really good showing of hands. You warm my heart. So this may sound familiar to you, but let's go over it together so we're on the same page. So queer is one of those words that means a whole bunch of different things to different people. Its meaning has changed over time, so it used to be derogatory, and now it's been kind of reclaimed. But there are these two main meanings that I want you to think about when I say the word queer. So first, queerness is this like umbrella term for lots of different identities and forms of expression that we think of as LGBT, right? So anything that's non-normative in terms of gender or sexual expression. So we could be talking about being gay, or being trans, or being asexual. It's like a whole range of desires and identities. But queerness also has this second meaning. It's this kind of conceptual meaning. And this is what I'm talking about when I talk about this thing called queer theory. And queerness in that context describes, it's like a way of doing things differently, or a way of being differently. So anytime that you're pushing back against the norm, you're queering something, or you're being queer, right? And that's especially related to any time you're pushing back against expectations, social expectations that relate to gender and sexuality. So when I say queer, I want you to hear both of those things at the same time. This big conceptual picture of queerness, but also the real, actual queer people in the world who are out there living our queer lives and facing those obstacles and those joys all at the same time. The other term I want to tell you about that you'll hear me say is this word affect. Affect is a really complicated concept that has this like long intellectual history, but for our purposes today, let's just go ahead and say it is a fancy academic term for emotions or feelings. So when I say affect in games, feel free just to go ahead and think, okay, Bonnie is talking about how games make players feel. Okay, so now we know what queerness is about, but when I talk to you about queerness and video games, this kind of intersection of the two, what does that look like? What does it look like to put the two things together? A lot of people, when I tell them that I work on queerness in games, they think that this is a really small issue, like a really niche issue. You know, people would be like, oh, you mean like in Mass Effect? Where ladies can kiss ladies? And sure, yeah. But also there's this whole other range of things that we can talk about. It's really vast and open to explore. So I'm going to tell you about some of the projects that I've been working on recently so that you can see what this intersection looks like, and then we'll use that as like a springboard into this specific idea of empathy. So these are some images from the Queerness in Games conference, which we call QGCon for short. And it's an annual conference that we organize in California. We just had our 4th year of the event a couple weeks ago. And it's me and an amazing group of collaborators, I should say. And it's a really unique event because it's part academic and part industry. So often game events are either people who make games or people who study games. Sometimes they kind of hate each other for reasons that confuse me, but we bring them together in the same space, and we have conversations. And that produces really interesting things. So for example, we had talks this year about queer Overwatch fans and how fans of Overwatch are queering that game through their fan art and their fan production. Or talks about Monster Factory, if you know that video series, and how you can see the monsters that are produced as queer figures. But then we also had workshops about designing LGBT characters or doing self-care for queer devs. So you can see it's both sides of that equation. And this event is really kind of near and dear to my heart because it's like a warm and fuzzy event, which sounds like a silly thing to say, but actually it's really important for building queer community or building community for marginalized people to have these warm and supportive spaces, especially because games, which I think we all know, right, games can be pretty hostile if you are seen as different. So making warm, supportive spaces is really important for supporting diversity. This whole academic field I'm talking to you about queerness and games has really blossomed over the last 5 years or so. And so now it has its own name as a field, which is Queer Game Studies. And that's also conveniently the name of this book that I co-edited that just came out. So this is new from University of Minnesota Press. You can buy it on Amazon. Ignore the hardcover price. It looks really weird and expensive, but actually the paperback is pretty reasonable. And so this is an edited volume with contributions from scholars and also game designers. So there are a lot of folks in here who I think you would recognize their names. So people like Jesper Juhl or Mattie Brice or Naomi Clark or Robert Yang. And they're coming together to ask these questions like, what would it mean to design a game queerly? So not just have LGBT people in a game, but to do game design, do mechanics queerly. Or things like, what's homophobic code? Can code be homophobic? Or there's a great piece on Bayonetta, who is often seen as this hyper-sexualized, objectified female character. But it's a lesbian writer talking about how Bayonetta is her personal fantasy, right? And how for her this is a queer game because she gets to play as Bayonetta, who's her ideal of a sexy woman. So it's really thought-provoking stuff, and I recommend checking it out. That's the book that just came out. I wrote a second book that hopefully will be out next year. And this is a monograph, so something that I wrote on my own. And it is called, I will give you the full title, Playing Queer, Sexuality, Gender, and Identity in Video Games Beyond Representation. Octodad is my mascot because there's a chapter on Octodad, and also it's my all-time favorite queer game, which we can talk about sometime if you like. And I'll probably make wriggling octopus motions to illustrate. So this book is about how we can look at games, we can look at queerness in games beyond LGBT characters, LGBT romances, and we can find queerness, this kind of concept of queerness, in the way that video games are played. So really often we hear this story about queerness in games that's this kind of it gets better narrative, right? That there never used to be queer people in games or in the games industry, but now today it's slowly getting better and we see more and more representation and we're on this upward slope towards hope, which sounds really nice, but actually it's a lot more complicated than that. And for me, I'm interested in kind of flipping that script and saying, no, you know what? Queer people have actually always belonged in video games. Video games have always been ours. Because if we read video games queerly, if we play them queerly, then we can reclaim them, right? So reaching back to our own histories, for someone like me, my own childhood, and being no, you know what? Screw that. I'm a queer person and games have been mine all along. So I'm using things like queer theory in this book to think about failing in video games, speed running, messy game physics, and to see those things as sites of resistance for pushing back against the status quo in games. And then I'll tell you about one last project. I'm one of these people who gets really excited about stuff, so I'm working on a bunch of things at once, but I'll tell you about this and then move into empathy. So this is an interview project. It's a book called The Queer Games Avant-Garde, LGBTQ Video Game Makers and the Future of Interactive Media. So it's a collection of profiles with contemporary indie game designers who either identify as queer or they make games that address queer issues. So the images you see on the slide are just some of my favorite of these games. I highly recommend all of them. Yes, you can just see from the thumb protruding out from this alien orifice that Consenticle is going to be a good time. I recommend it. So these are some of my favorites, but there are tons of these games out there right now. You might be familiar with some of them. And there's this really big, vibrant network of queer game makers operating right now that, in my opinion, is really pushing the medium forward. So we're seeing a lot of change in indie game making and game making in general, and these queer game makers are really at the front of that. So that's what that project is about. Excuse me. You'll also hear me reference some of these interviews as I talk about empathy and affect because they've just been really productive. Like, I kind of thought that talking to game makers would be a little bit like pulling teeth. Like, I would be like, tell me about what your game means. And they would be like, play my game. And you, like, it will speak for itself. And actually, these interviews have been just like totally eye-opening. Everyone has been just like amazingly smart and insightful about their work. So that'll be a cool project that'll come out in a couple years. And then I also want to give a shout out while I'm on the topic of queer game studies to say this is totally not just me. There's a whole bunch of us working on queer game studies right now. These are some of the folks operating in the States and in Canada. They're great people to check out if you're interested in learning more about this work. Or if you just want a link to go to because you live on the internet to learn more about this work. This is a kind of 101 that's up on my website. That you can go to. It's just got an FAQ, it's got a list of readings, it's got a list of games to play. It's kind of like a crash course in getting to know this whole thing called queer games and queer game studies. Okay, so let's talk about empathy. So empathy is related to this whole queerness and games things for some reasons that you'll see in a moment, but also because empathy is a form of affect, right? A form of feeling. And affect is a really important part of queerness and queer theory. So for the past couple decades, like the past 15 years or so, the most influential people doing work on affect, like theorizing what it means in culture, these are people who are queer theorists. So they're coming out of this field, and that's people like Lauren Berlant or Eve Sedgwick or Sarah Ahmed, all fun recommended reading, a little bit dense, but I think also really interesting and inspiring. And these are the kind of perspectives that I think we should be applying to thinking about video games and feeling in video games. So empathy is related to queerness, but it also brings up a whole bunch of even bigger, broader questions about video games and culture. And these are some really important questions. So if this seems like a specific topic, like this one thing of empathy, it's got these really broad stakes for talking about games, and especially games and diversity. So these are questions that I kind of want you to listen for in the background as I'm talking. They're things like, how are games supposed to make us feel, right? And who are video games supposed to be for? And what's the right way, the socially just way to design diversity in video games? So you can start to see the bigger stakes of the argument. Challenging ourselves, challenging yourselves as game makers to confront these questions is a really crucial part of making video games more inclusive and more ethically responsible as a medium. Okay, I'm going to tell you my argument in one big burst, so it's right there in front of you, and then we'll kind of back it up step by step, and I'll walk you through it. So here's the thing that I want to convince you of as I talk to you today. Over the past couple years, empathy has become this really popular buzzword in talking about video games. The idea that video games should make players feel empathy, it sounds really good, right? But actually, if we look at it critically, it becomes really problematic. And we're going to see that through this tension between empathy and queer games. But rather than just embracing empathy, right, saying it's good, or dismissing it, saying it's bad, I think that what we need to do if we want to value social justice in games is we need to deconstruct it. We need to spend some time kind of making sense of this idea of empathy so that we can find what works, we can find what doesn't work, and then ultimately we can find these different models for thinking about togetherness in games that are more positive and more constructive. So, not coincidentally, because I study queer people and queer theory, for me, I think some of the most powerful alternative models for thinking about affect in games are ones that can come from queer and feminist theory. And so these theories, which seem like they don't relate to games, actually, if we bring them over into games, we can start to see them as new lenses for thinking about emotions, and they can inspire developers like you to design and understand affect in games differently. Okay, so that's the big picture, right? Let's back it up and we'll work back through it. So the first thing to understand about why critiquing empathy matters is to know that this question of video games and how they make players feel, not just how they make players feel, but how they're supposed to make players feel, right? Like what's socially accepted, what's socially valued, and how they make players feel. This has this really long history in games. And across that history, this issue of affect in games has always been political, right? There's that word again. Even when it seems like that's not true, actually especially when it seems like emotions in video games have nothing to do with like politics, they really do. And when I say politics here, just to be clear, I'm not talking about politics like government politics. I'm talking about this broader sense of politics that have to do with power and who's represented in the world and the kind of big cultural forces that shape our world. So for a long time, when we talked about emotions in video games, the big thing that we were talking about was fun. And when I say we, I'm talking about game academics, game developers, game players. It's this kind of big landscape of discourse, right? The way that we talk about games. So for a long time, that was dominated by fun. And researchers like Nicole Lazzaro or designers like Ralph Koster are some of the big names that might come to mind for you when you think about fun in games. They've been really foundational. And maybe you've gotten this advice, but for years, game designers have been told that for a game to be good, right, and I'm going to always do the scare quotes around good, that it should be fun first, right? It can have other messages, it can be serious in other ways, but to be successful, it should be fun first. I kind of hate fun. I wrote an article about this a couple of years ago, and I called this the hegemony of fun. Right, so hegemony is one of those kind of big concept terms that just means the like norms, the big normative oppressive systems of culture. There's nothing wrong with a game being fun. That is totally fine with me. The thing that I take umbrage with, right, I think is problematic, is that when we insist that the main feeling that video games should communicate has to be fun, right? That all games to be good need to be fun first. That's actually really restrictive and even kind of oppressive. So video games are a powerful medium. They can make us feel all kinds of feelings, and both Doris's talk and Sabina's talks have been about this too, right? There's a ton of potential in games for communicating different types of feeling. They can be ecstasy or anger or sadness. And I will say that lately we've seen a little bit more interest out there in games that are what I think of as no fun, right, as opposed to fun, and that Dragon Cancer is a really good example of that. But in games culture, fun it's not just like a semantic thing. It's actually a really big issue for diversity, because fun is used all the time to shut down conversations about the social meanings behind games. And maybe you've had these experiences on the internet, as I often do. So the idea of fun is being used to police what kind of work is allowed to be part of the game's conversation. So it's really common for reactionary gamers to argue that we shouldn't talk about video games through identity because they're just for fun, right? This idea that we can't analyze them, they're just for fun. Or to say that certain games, for example, like Depression Quest, that these games don't even count as games. For a number of reasons, but one of them is that they're not about being fun. Right? So fun shuts down these conversations, it tells us what can and can't be a game, and often when we talk about fun this way, the perspectives that get silenced, it's not just random whose games get shut down. It's often the voices of women or queer people or people of color, right? Depression Quest is a great example of that. with Zoe Quinn as the lead designer. So that's a really clear example of what I mean when I say that affect in video games, the way that we talk about affect in video games as a culture, that's political, right? It shuts down certain voices. But over the past couple years, fun has been eclipsed by this other term, this other buzzword that we're seeing all over games culture and the games industry, and that word is empathy. So you all spend a lot of time playing and thinking about and reading about games, so you've probably come across this term a bunch as well. Let's start with the definition. I'm not normally one of those people that's the like Merriam-Webster's defines the following term as people, but I think it's actually really useful here because once we know what empathy really means, we can start to contrast it to the way that people are using it to talk about games, because there are some real differences there. So here's the definition. Empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. Sounds pretty simple, right? The ability to understand and share the feelings of another. But the word that I really want to draw your attention to here is the word share. So when you share someone else's feelings, if we just kind of stop and think that through for a second, it means that you feel them too. You don't just know about them, you actually feel them too. And so when people describe empathy, they use these metaphors like stepping into someone's shoes or seeing through somebody else's eyes. And those are actually pretty accurate for explaining empathy, right? They're not just metaphors about experiencing what someone experiences, they're about experiencing what someone experiences, but not just understanding it, like inhabiting it, stepping into it. And today, it kind of feels like everywhere you look, empathy is being held up as this new gold standard of game design. It's being talked about at game industry conferences like at GGC. It's being celebrated in these news articles that are popular news, but also like game industry sites like Gamasutra. And it's becoming a marketing tool for selling games and game-related products, right? This game promises you 10 times more empathy than other games before it. So when we hear about empathy in these mainstream game spaces, it's almost always described as this really exciting, promising, positive thing. We hear about how video games have the power to create more empathy than any other medium. This is my like PR person voice, right? Or about how a game is changing the world because it makes people feel empathy for those who are less fortunate. And so more and more often, video games are being talked about as these empathy machines. And the rhetoric of empathy is particularly common when it comes to two specific types of games. And so this is important. We're starting to talk about empathy in general, but over the last few years, these two types of games that we talk about most often. One of them is virtual reality. That's not what I'm going to focus on here, but it's also totally fascinating. Something we can talk about in the Q&A, and it brings up all these issues. Most often people talk about refugees and being able to empathize with the experience of refugees through VR. But the other type of game that gets talked about through empathy a lot, and this is what I am going to focus on, is queer games. And especially these small-scale indie games by queer game makers that I was telling you about that are part of this, what I call the queer games avant-garde. Many of the really best-known contemporary indie queer games, so if you've heard of any of these are probably some of the ones you've heard of. Games like Merrit Kopas's Limb or Anna Anthropy's Dysphoria. These games have been really widely described as empathy games, not by the people who make them, but by the people who play them or teach them or write about them. And when people call them empathy games, what they mean is that these games supposedly allow players to experience the struggles of LGBT people. Right? So in the case of Limb, which is a game about, kind of symbolically about trans passing as a transgender person, the experience you're supposed to be inhabiting is what is it like to try and pass for cisgender when you walk down the street? Or in the case of Dysphoria, which is about gender transition, what are the kind of like trials and tribulations that you go through trying to transition from male to female? So these games get praised a lot. They've gotten lots of great attention, specifically because people talk about them as allowing straight players, so players who aren't queer, to step into the shoes of a queer person so that they can understand and share, right? You can hear that empathy definition, understand and share, these queer lives and the challenges they face. This is what's supposed to make them great as empathy games. Which sounds pretty good, right? You can understand and share what a queer person is going through. But a lot of queer people, myself included, actually find that really worrisome. The idea that a 10-minute game like Dysphoria can make you understand and share what it's like to be a trans person, for example. So actually, it's the very same queer game makers whose games are being praised as empathy games who are speaking out against the notion of empathy. So they're like vocally and publicly rejecting this idea of empathy. So some of these folks are like Merrit Kopas and Anna Anthropy, also Mattie Brice, Robert Yang, AVB. They have all written about or made creative work that is explicitly against empathy. Some of these are really scathing polemics. Like Robert Yang has a great article that I really recommend called "If You Walk in Someone Else's Shoes, You've Stolen Their Shoes." And I'll come back to that idea. This is an example from Mattie Brice. So this is a performance piece called Empathy Game that she ran a few years ago. Mattie is well known for making this game called Menichi, which is just a really small scale game where you play through a day of her life as a trans woman of color facing discrimination on the street and trying to navigate what that means day to day for your own existence. And people talk about it all the time as an empathy game. And so to push back against that, Mattie created this performance piece where in order to play Menichi, which you can't see in this shot, but it's being projected on the screen behind her, her body is the controller. So she's sitting there brushing her hair, she's wearing a bra and underwear, and you have to reach out and touch different parts of her body to control the game that is being projected. And so the idea there is to say, I am not just this 2-minute game, right? Like I am a real flesh and blood person, and if you really want to like understand me and make contact with me, you've got to come and touch me. And it's uncomfortable, right? But there's a message there in making it uncomfortable. So these folks, in talking about empathy, have done a really good job of articulating what's wrong with calling queer games empathy games. So I'm going to give you a kind of quick overview of the arguments that they've made, and then I'm going to take that into this like broader critique of why empathy in games, not just in queer games, but empathy in games is problematic, and what we can do differently. Okay, so what's wrong with calling queer games empathy games? Here's the idea in a nutshell. Right. First, calling queer games empathy games incorrectly assumes that a queer game has been designed primarily to educate straight, cisgender people. In fact, many queer game makers see themselves as developing work that is by queer people, about queer people, and for queer people. Right? They don't see themselves as making work that's for the consumption and enlightenment of straight, cis players. And so this comes back to that question that I posed a little while ago, this question of who are games supposed to be for? We can see the assumption here that games are made for normative people, whereas queer game makers often see themselves as making games for other queer people. The other thing that's really problematic here is that in calling queer games empathy games, you suggest that playing a video game for a few minutes, or even a few hours, can give you this meaningful experience of understanding and sharing what it's like to be an LGBT person. No video game can give you that experience. And that's not because there's some failing in video games, right? First of all, video games are artistic interpretations of life. They're not what we would call a mimetic reflection. They're not like a perfect mirror of reality, because they're not supposed to be, right? That's not how art works. It's not just reality. But also, no game can replicate for you the real stakes of being a queer body in the world every single day, right? To be a queer person means to go out and put yourself on the line and be at risk. At least, right, I come from America, and so there's a very real risk every time you're visible and you're out of verbal or physical abuse. And that a game cannot, in a real meaningful way, give you that experience. So when we think about games as so-called empathy games, queer games as empathy games in this way, we can start to see how this idea of empathy, which sounds really good, sounds really positive, is actually being used in this like cultural context to control the narrative about queer games and what they mean and why they matter and who they matter to. So by speaking out against empathy, queer game makers are actually kind of enacting this fight to take queer games back and to put them back in the hands of queer people. So that's the argument about what's problematic about calling queer games empathy games. But actually, more and more empathy is being used to talk about lots of types of games. We're seeing it kind of expand out from queer games and VR into lots of types of games. And there's also a switch that's happening here where with those queer games, queer game makers were making them, and then other folks were coming in and being like, you made an awesome empathy game, right? Like that label was being applied to the queer games. Now we're seeing more and more people, more and more studios who are explicitly dedicated to being like, we're gonna make empathy games. We're gonna change the world by making empathy games. So there's a shift happening there. So empathy is becoming really broadly relevant across games and the games industry, and I think that these queer perspectives are a really helpful launching point for critiquing that empathy more broadly. So what are these larger issues around empathy in games, and what is it that you should be wary of? Because this is one of the main takeaways I'll come back to at the end, that if you walk away from this talk with anything, what I want you to walk away with is the next time you are in a group or you're talking to someone and they're like, this game should be about empathy, I want you to be like, should it? And to have this moment of like critical self-reflection. So that's what we're aiming for. So what should you be watching out for? What should you be thinking about? First, there's this issue of appropriation. You get points if you know the reference in the image. Anyone? Thank you. Thank you. Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, classic queer movie. Please go watch it if you haven't seen it. So appropriation. So when we talk about appropriation, we often talk about cultural appropriation. But there's also just the appropriation of someone's individual experiences. So like the experience of someone's gender transition, you can appropriate that. And when you appropriate something, you take it, right? Or you at least take a part of it. You kind of make this claim that you have some ownership to that experience. And that's the point that's really summed up nicely in this title I mentioned from Robert Yang, the when you walk in someone's shoes, you've stolen their shoes, right? When you have this empathetic experience with somebody, it actually requires like stepping out and taking some of it from them. And then appropriation is related to these other problems like tourism and colonialism. So if you create a game about empathy, right, an empathy game that's about showing people what it's like to be different, you kind of inadvertently create this thing where your players get to become tourists. Or Lisa Nakamura has this term that's really helpful that she uses to talk about race on the internet called identity tourists. So you get to play a game where you play these other identities. And it's even, like, just to push it even further, it's this kind of embodied colonialism. So you get to go in and occupy a body. You get to occupy the embodied experience of someone who's different from you. And you can see that in these metaphors that are actually really fittingly bodily metaphors about invasion, right? Like seeing through someone else's eyes is about getting into their body and seeing through their eyes. And if we stop and think about that, that's actually kind of a worrisome metaphor, right? Another problem with empathy, in this broader sense, is that it takes all the potentially socially disruptive feelings, all the potentially radical feelings that video games can make us feel, and it makes them safe. Have you encountered this before? This is a favorite queer mantra. I recommend using it in the world. So for example, if a game makes you feel something that actually pushes back against social expectations, but then you say, oh, this is really an empathy game, it sort of strips it, it takes the teeth out of it, right? It makes it culturally acceptable, and it makes it more relatable to the status quo. And instead, all these other feelings go away, like anger or desire. It all gets lumped back into empathy instead. And that actually speaks to this bigger truth about affect in video games, that often the way we talk about affect in games, like fun or empathy, the cultural narrative that's going on is really about kind of regulating how players are supposed to feel, which means it's about regulating what kinds of games get made, what kind of games we should be valuing, right? So there's a kind of like unintentional, unspoken, like social control thing going on. So for example, with queer games, if a good game is an empathy game, right, and an empathy game is one that's designed for straight people, then a bad game is not an empathy game, and a bad game is for queer people, right? And all of a sudden, good means it's for straight people, and bad means it's for queer people, and like, whoa, that's a really, really heavy social judgment. So the thing I want to communicate to you about that is that when we talk about design principles as good or bad, those aren't objective either. Like, there are always politics and social meaning behind our design principles as well. And I was going to talk to you about Marxism and how empathy embodies use value in neoliberalism, but instead I'm going to breeze past that and give you this really dapper photo of Marx. I just want to note that he's got his hand like tucked into his jacket like Napoleon. I find that really charming. So to get beyond empathy, right, to start looking for other ways of talking about affect in games, there are a bunch of things that we need to rethink. So we're trying to get at this like root of the problem beneath empathy, not just like say no more to empathy itself. And to do that, we have to kind of dig deeply into some of the big ideas that we hold about games and players and meaning, these like big things we take for granted. And one of those things is identification, right? So empathy, in a way, is about identification, at least like on an emotional level. When we talk about empathizing with somebody, like, for example, a trans person, you might say, I now identify with the feeling that you're feeling. And then when we talk about diversity in games, we also talk about identification a lot, right? Like, we need more diverse characters in games so that diverse people who play can identify with those characters, right? And in some ways, that is super important. Like, I don't mean to say to you, like, you totally should be putting more, like, women and queer people and black and brown people and non-neurotypical people in your games. Like, please do that and do it now. But also, identification is more complicated than that. It's more complicated than just seeing someone on the screen and feeling instantly connected. There are things that need to happen in the moments when you can't identify with somebody. So sometimes the lessons that our players learn that are most important come when they encounter another person, when they encounter a character, for example, that they can't identify with. Because it's okay when you can't identify with somebody, because that person's life is just as valid, is just equally as valid as your own, even if you don't identify with it. And that's a really important lesson for our players. And then even deeper than that, I think we need to reconsider this like cultural value that we share, that understanding and sharing, this really basic definition of empathy, that's something we should be striving for, right? That's something we should all value. Because actually, understanding is sometimes the wrong goal. You shouldn't have to understand the position of a marginalized person in order to care about them, right? They shouldn't have to give you a piece of their experience in order for you to respect them. Oppressed people shouldn't have to educate privileged people in order to make them feel compassion. Right? So empathy promises us this opportunity to understand one another, but it's equally important, and it might actually be more important for us and for our players to respect the people that they don't understand. So I don't mean to suggest that there's nothing good in empathy. I think this whole discussion of empathy in games culture and the games industry, sometimes it's got the real flavor of like a marketing ploy, but often it comes from a really good place. So to pull out that good and to do away with the bad, there are some things we need to start seeing differently about empathy in games. So one of those things is that we can ask ourselves, okay, whose empathy is this? And this whole time I've been talking about empathy, I've been talking about empathy between the player and a character, right? And this is what we mostly mean when we talk about empathy in games, that your player is going to feel empathy for a character. But that's not the only place where there's empathy, right? Like anytime there are two people relating to one another, there can be empathy. So I really love this book, Empathy Engines by Elizabeth Sampot, who's a game designer. I was talking to her about it the other day, and I was like, Elizabeth, I love your work, but come on, empathy? Like your book is called Empathy Engines? And she totally flipped my perspective, because for her, it's not about designing games that allow players to feel empathy with marginalized characters. It's actually empathy as a design principle. So it's for game designers, right, that game designers need to empathize with their players and respect their players. So she works in free-to-play mostly, and at least in the States, we all have feelings about free-to-play these days. And often we feel things like, oh, it's unethical because it exploits players. So it's actually like really revolutionary to say, no, as a free-to-play designer, I empathize with my players. I respect them. I think about how they feel, and I try and feel that too. So that's one place that I think we can kind of reclaim empathy. But the other thing that's really important is not to take for granted what we even mean by empathy. So often we use this word and we're like tossing it around in game spaces as if we all know what it means. And I gave you that definition of empathy, but actually I think that when we use it, we often mean like a whole bunch of different things. And once we start pulling those apart, we can start identifying the parts of it that are powerful and the parts of it that we want to set aside and move beyond. So the most basic, pedantic way to try and understand what we mean when we talk about empathy is to say that I think sometimes when we say empathy, what we really mean is sympathy. And sometimes, this is the cynic in me, people say empathy because it's like sympathy, but it sounds cool. Right? Actually, empathy and sympathy mean really different things. So Thesaurus Dictionary Cat is back to tell you the difference between those definitions. So whereas empathy means the ability to understand and share the feelings of another, sympathy means feeling pity or sorrow for someone else's misfortune. So it's not about sharing someone's feeling or appropriating someone's feeling. It's about feeling your own feeling about their experience. And I think sometimes people are like wary of this idea of pity, right? That it's going to be condescending to say, oh, you're a marginalized person and I pity you. As a queer person, from my own experience, I can tell you that I would much rather tell you about being discriminated against and have a conversation with you where you're like, I feel sorrow for that experience, than I would like to have you say, oh, we talked about it for 10 minutes. I now know how you feel. Because you don't. And even like games invite you to interact. Games are interactive systems that can make meaning, can make arguments. That's really powerful, but it's still not enough for you to actually know how someone feels. Even beyond that like empathy, sympathy thing though, actually I think empathy is being used to, it's like almost like a disguise. It's like a box that we're putting all these other forms of affect into, and we're like, my game makes empathy, my game makes empathy. And in some ways, it's doing some really interesting things to allow us to put a whole bunch of different feelings into games without needing to call them by name. So some of those feelings are, the one that's like, I think most iffy is this self-satisfied feeling of allyship. So sometimes when we say a game makes us feel empathy, I think what we actually mean is a game makes me feel good because I spent 10 minutes playing the life of a trans person, right? Like, I feel better about myself. I feel like an ally. That one's a little iffy. But some of these other ones are actually really valuable. So sometimes when people talk about empathy, like especially in VR, they're actually talking about immersion or embodiment, this feeling of like fully being in a game. Sometimes they're talking about caring and respect. So actually really like thinking of characters as people with their own inner lives and caring about that. And then the ones that I'm most interested in, sometimes we're talking about compassion, or we're talking about intimacy. And intimacy is a form of connection. It's a form of togetherness, right? Like empathy is a form of togetherness, right? I feel for you. We are two humans who have something in common now. But intimacy and compassion are really different ways of thinking about what it means to be together in a game. A quick recommendation I would make if you're interested in this idea of empathy really meaning intimacy is this game Unravel. There was a really interesting talk at GGC a few months ago called Designing Empathy as a Game Mechanic. Kind of interesting. But what the designers of this game talked about actually is not what I think of as empathy. What they talked about was love and heartbreak. So they said, we wanted to create a character, this little yarn character, who's moving around this 2D platforming space. We wanted to create a character who felt vulnerable, so that the player would feel love for that character, and then when that character was in peril, they would feel heartbreak. That's really cool, but that's not empathy, right? So I think actually what's happening in a moment like that is that empathy is allowing these other experiences in games, like love and heartbreak and attachment and intimacy. We don't usually value those things in games. Like we have discussions in spaces like this, but when you go out into the industry, you're not like, I want to make a game about like heartbreak between me and a yarn creature. That's not, someone's going to be like, and what's your market for that? So empathy is this kind of like socially acceptable way to have all these other emotions pass, to like go out into your design and have them pass as acceptable. But I think what's important is that we stop trying to pass, right? And we start calling the things we want to design for by their real names, right? Instead of saying, this is an empathy game, saying this is a game about heartbreak, right? Or saying this is a game about grief, or this is a game about a complicated human relationship, right? To be brave enough in our design and in the way we talk about games to call these things by their real names. We also need alternatives to empathy. I think the value of empathy is it's this like conceptual framework for thinking about affect in games. It gives us this like big concept that we can use to think big ideas. But we need different frameworks because empathy is problematic in all these ways. It's got all this baggage. So what are some other ways we can think about affect in games that gets us to the good stuff and sets aside the problematic stuff? And that's where I want to leave you just with some suggestions about thinking about queer theory and feminist theory as places to look for that. So this is Donna Haraway. She is one of my academic heroes because she's super quirky and brilliant. So Donna Haraway, you might have heard of her for this really famous essay called A Cyborg Manifesto. That's one of the earliest like feminist writings on being like tech and human together. It's really cool. But she wrote this book about 10 years ago now called When Species Meet. She's super into the relationships between humans and other species, and especially like companion species like dogs. This is her hanging out with her dog, who she loves dearly. And the two concepts from that book that I want to point you toward, this concept of being with and the mutual gaze. So being with, the example she uses is a shark and a remora. So sharks are sharks, you know sharks. Remoras are these little fish that live a symbiotic life with sharks. By hanging out with them and kind of eating smaller like algae and smaller fish around them, they are two separate creatures, right? But they live a life together. And so I think that's a really valuable model for thinking about what would it mean to be together with someone in a game, intimately together, without needing to understand or appropriate their experience. The other thing she talks about is this mutual gaze. So not just looking at something, not just seeing through someone else's eyes, but actually looking at each other, right? So not stepping into someone's body, but being like, I'm a body over here, you're a body over there, I'm gonna look at you, respect you, make eye contact with you symbolically, and we're gonna understand each other. So what I want you to take from that is walking alongside someone is better than walking in their shoes, right? Looking someone else in the eye is better than seeing through their eyes. These are models that are different, that give us fundamentally different ethics for how we think about what it means to be together in video games, with each other, with our players. They're fundamentally more socially just models for being together. So I told you this is the message I want you to walk away with, that if you are talking to people about empathy in games, be wary. Doesn't mean just shut down the conversation, doesn't mean don't do it, it means just be aware, right? Be wary. Stay critical, but also celebrate the kernel of what is good and warm and just. So somewhere in that empathy discussion, there's probably something well-intentioned, there's probably something good. Find it, pull it out, and call it by its real name. And then find your own models for designing human connection. So this is one that resonates with me, Donna Haraway's ideas, coming out of queer and feminist theory, but there are ones that will resonate with you. And find your own and let them be an inspiration for your design. So takeaways. Feelings matter for social justice. Figure out the feeling you really truly mean and design for that and call it by its name. Stop stealing people's shoes. That's not just you, it's everyone, right? Other people's stories might inspire you, but they don't belong to you, and they don't belong to your players. And then just stop designing for empathy, please. Just stop designing for empathy, right? You can do more. You can design for compassion, you can design for intimacy, you can do more. Thank you very much. So I know that asking questions is daunting, especially in this like student-y environment. So I have given you some starter questions that you are welcome to try or ignore. Whatever is cool. They are, what about empathy in VR? You mentioned that, but then you didn't talk about it. Okay, but isn't it like fundamentally a good thing to want to create empathy through games? Yeah, kind of. We can talk about that. What's an example of game concept that illustrates this whole being with thing? So cool abstract idea, but like what would that actually look like in a game? And then the like most important and serious question, which is what's your favorite queer game character in a video game? And is it Valdo from the Soul Calibur series? We can talk about that one a lot. Whatever you would like to ask, please feel free.
Hello, well, thank you for your talk. You bring up 3 words that I'm thinking about a lot: empathy, sympathy, and compassion. And I come from the part where I know that, at least let me put it like this, it's been done experiments showing that sympathy, empathy, compassion activates different brain circuitries. So my thinking when I'm sitting here and listening to you is not having to do with queer, it's more having to do with what can we actually do for people with games that are in their professional lives exposed to real hard empathy situation, trying to reach out and do the best they can for others and getting into the situation of compassion fatigue, which is not actually, it's quite hard when you get there.
Yeah.
So do you think it's possible to, in games, help, empower people that are going out and facing hard situations for others so they don't burn out? Can we play with games so we actually help people move their circuitries, their brain circuitry from empathy into compassion or sympathy?
That's a really cool idea. So I have to say my background is in cultural studies and media studies, so the like actual hardwired realities of people are not something that I'm an expert on. I'm more in this kind of like theoretical cultural vein. But what I love about that, I was just talking about this earlier today with one of my fellow presenters. There are professions where we experience empathy fatigue and empathy burnout. And being not a dude and being a queer person in academia is one of those spaces, right? Because you draw toward you people who feel discriminated against, and then you take on their feelings for them, right? And I think that's part of, despite all this, I'm someone who feels a lot of empathy, and that's, like, it's tricky. So I love this idea that...
It's a beautiful thing, but, you know, you have to be able to deal with it.
Yeah, it's wonderful and exhausting.
Yes.
So I really love this idea that games could not teach empathy, but teach other ways of relating to people that actually, like, allow you to reserve your own empathy resources.
It's empowering you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Check out Tanya Singer's work.
Okay.
Max Planck, she does fMRI studies on empathy and sympathy. It's really interesting work, and if we could combine that with game, that would be lovely.
I will definitely look into that, thank you.
Let me know when you do.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much for this talk. There are a lot of answers to problems that I faced while making games. And I think, I'm walking away with so many takeaways.
Thank you for your talk. It totally wrecked me, but in the best possible way.
Okay, thank you. One thing that I was wondering, you brought up the intersectionality, like the I word.
Yeah.
I was wondering on your perspective, or the potential of queerness in the context of race. Yeah. Because that's something that as white people we often ignore in the queer context as well. And I'm just reading this amazing book called White Innocence by Gloria Wecker. And I just opened my Kindle reader on this page with this quote, just that also includes the word compassion here. It says, the politics of compassion is that is that whites can only interact with blacks on the basis of pity and compassion, not on the basis of egalitarianism. Now she seems to have a notion of compassion. This is a little bit different from the way you used it. But I was wondering, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great point. And thank you for bringing race more into this discussion, because I think it's super important. Yeah, I think part of this is that often when we talk in game development spaces, we aim towards clear takeaways, right? Like, do this and don't do this. Actually, a lot of this is really messy, right? Like, empathy is messy. I think there are some really great things we want to do when we design for empathy, and there are some really problematic things. And I think compassion is one of those things, too, where I personally can really see the value as an alternative way of thinking, but you're absolutely right that especially like race in America, at least, there's this history of like white pity for people of color, and that's right, that's condescending, that's belittling, that's infantilizing, that's problematic too. So I want to check out that text and think about it more, but I think in some ways the answer is like no model is perfect, but any model that generates critical thinking and self-awareness is important.
Yes. I'm fascinated because this book is actually on the context of Dutch race issues.
Oh, interesting.
And I would claim that's a pan-European thing, almost the dynamics she describes, but it's interesting that you immediately applied on the American context as well. So maybe we have some collective work to do as white people.
Totally, yeah. Thank you. That was also a great suggestion.
Thank you for this talk, Bonnie. I have a question around these metaphors that you're using about looking somebody in the eye or walking with them, maybe even the stealing the shoes one.
Yeah.
To me, this where I used to, at least, we will see if I continue to do that, think about empathy as a way of, I have now maybe been able to show that somebody is privileged, that there's systematic exploitations and injustices happening in the world. But that by itself doesn't necessarily inspire any change. I mean, you can look somebody in the eye and then tell them to do what you want them to. You can have them walk next to you to continue waving cold air next to you, pull your rickshaw, and then eat your scraps.
Yeah.
Right? So without a sort of emotional understanding to that, you can just accept injustice as, is acceptable to you. I mean, you're fine with it, right? So from that perspective, without this step of, well, you're better off now, but you have you don't deserve this at all. You just had a lucky dice roll at your character creation screen. That's about it. How are you left with, well, sure, you can look these people in the eye and say, well, as we saw earlier today, faggot die, you know? Yeah. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, which is, I think to rephrase the question, I would say it's something like, okay, there are things that are problematic with empathy, but what if our players or anyone in the world, right, needs that emotional sense of sharing the feeling, understanding the feeling in order to care, right? Like, and I think that's a very real thing that we face. I have the privileged position of standing here as someone whose primary job is not to make games, but to talk to people about making games. And so I can kind of give you these imperatives to do them differently. But I think there's a personal balance between wanting to make games that already are effective because of how people already experience the world, right? Like, I need to feel your feeling in order to care, versus games that say, I reject that basic thing, and I'm going to do this differently. So I wonder if there's space to make games that take that basic premise that you need to empathize to care and reject that premise. I also think there are examples that we don't talk about where empathy does the opposite, where being able to feel what someone else feels by making you feel that you are connected actually stops compassion. So this is my own personal shameful anecdote, which is that as a kid at summer camp, I went to a very privileged summer camp in the States, and we would give some amount of money every year to a charity. And we had this girl who we were sending money to overseas, and she would send us a letter back every year that said, here's what I'm up to, thank you so much for your support. And one year she sent us a letter that said, I bought a used Game Boy this year. Here's a picture of me with it. It's my favorite thing. Thank you so much. And this group of like 200 privileged white girls was like, she has a Game Boy. We have Game Boys. She's too much like us now. We are cutting off our support of her. And that's always really struck me, that that's a moment where we could identify with her through video games. Like, we felt we were the same. And so that actually stopped our compassion for her. That's also messy, right? But I think that my answer is, like, there's a tangle of things going on there, and as a designer, you kind of have to pick which axe you want to grind.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hey, Bonnie, that was awesome. You left me with a lot of conflicting, uncomfortable, hard thoughts. I listened to your talk both from the perspective of a player and a designer. And in one way, I understood this as a challenge towards players for more literacy and a more critical approach to games, that just because you play this you shouldn't assume that now you understand everything about a topic. But speaking from the designer's perspective, or looking at this as a designer, do we deliberately try not to create empathy? I'm not done. I mean, what if I try to self-express, right? I make a game, which a lot of art is about self-expression, about a specific experience that I feel like, I don't know, sharing, putting out there. And then somebody plays it and takes something away from that, and now did maybe end up understanding my perspective better. I just evoked empathy. I didn't put it in there for somebody to take it out exactly as I put it in there, but I don't think we can do that. But it happened. Should I not have done that? What do I do with this?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? So like, if you create something and someone else walks away having empathized with it, did you do something wrong? No, I am totally of the camp that, like, right, which was mentioned this morning, I'm of the camp that when you create games and you put them out in the world, they exist there, they now have their own lives, and those lives are symbiotic with their players. So that's totally cool with me. I think for me, the thing would be, from a design perspective, like, are you creating that situation they empathize with from your own experience, from the experience of someone on your team, right? Like, and this is just advice for all designers, especially game students. If you want to make a game that represents a diverse perspective, please, please, please have someone on your team who represents that perspective, or at least someone who's consulting who represents that perspective. So if you're making a game that speaks to your own experience and someone empathizes with it, that strikes me as really different than being like, I'm going to research the experience of someone else far across the world I haven't talked to, and then offer that as a like consumable empathy product. Yeah, thanks.
So yeah, that was amazing. It was the knowledge mic drop thing. That was brilliant. Voldo's my favorite character. Do you want to talk about Voldo for a minute?
I do, thank you. Okay, so queerness, I promise this relates. Queerness is a really vast thing, right? And so often we end up talking about gay people, but there are lots of forms of desire that fall into queerness, and one that is really important to me as a person and as a researcher is kink. Kink is so related to games and related to play spaces and related to just like the language of play, right? Like kink is play. Voldo I love because he's one of our few explicitly kinky characters. In older Soul Calibur games, he's got like the full-on leather gear, he's got the ball gag, and he's just like the queerest embodied character ever because he moves in this like abject, monstrous way with the long, like almost Wolverine-like fingers, and he rolls and dances, which is this like a kind of like beautifully effeminate gender non-normative thing. I think he is an awesome, queer, kinky role model in video games, and I aspire to be like Voldo. Thank you. Should we wrap up? Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thank you for your questions. Thanks for having me.